Hello and welcome to my second part of a more articulate look into Super Mario Galaxy's treasured music, this time coming from the second game in the series. Much like the first game, Super Mario Galaxy 2 established a clear orchestral theme. As an interesting note, the sound team at Nintendo originally was reluctant to bring back the orchestra a second time around due to some complications with recording. However, when Shigeru Miyamoto heard of this issue, he immediately greenlit the use of the orchestra, stating that he felt players expected the orchestra's sound to be back. I think we can all agree that this was the correct decision. Nintendo brought back veterans Mahiro Yokota and Koji Kondo, along with newcomer Ryo Nagamatsu, for the score. While Yokota composed the majority of the soundtrack, Kondo did contribute several tracks of his own, one of them being this song, Starship Mario. Today we'll be looking at the first iteration of Starship Mario. There were actually 3 versions that progressively come larger in size, much like the observatory music back in the first game. The tempo of the piece is set at 110 beats per minute, and the time signature is in 4/4. As some general first impressions, I enjoy the combination of both the violin pizzicato and the harp in this first section. Also, the way the woodwind melodies follow each other in the following sections really brings a light and joyous feeling throughout. The only real tense moment is in sections 2 and 1E when the tremolo strings are introduced. Here we have a quite narrow selection of instruments, mainly the strings, the harps, and the woodwinds. In the string section, the violins, violas, and cellos are present. As you'll see in the top strings, the violins and violas, they sound extra shimmery due to the EQ I added to the high end. Also take note of the violins and the cellos, which switch to pizzicato for most of the song after the intro. Accompanying the strings are the 2 harps, each of them with a different sound to add texture. As you can visually see, the harp number 1 plays these glissandos and these single notes, while the second harp contributes to the main pattern of the song. Lastly, we have the flute, clarinet, oboe, and bass flute as the final instruments. Each of these instruments take the melody away from each other in sequence. Only at section 3 is when we see that 2 woodwinds are played together, the clarinet and the bass flute. The intro is quite different from all the other sections. It prominently features the strings alone, which is not seen anywhere else. This intro actually reminds me of a lot of the classic Mario themes, especially if you speed the tempo up. I wouldn't be surprised if Koji got his inspiration from his previous works, such as Super Mario World. This downward progression of the F major scale in the strings gives off a waltz feeling. I just love the way it ends on the last 2 notes as a way of concluding this short motif. That's another parallel to the old Mario themes, how a section has its own intro and conclusion. The violins and violas harmonize with each other by a third, with the lower harmony belonging to the violas, of course. Other than that, they are exactly the same. At the end of this section here, you see the cello playing this low C note, which increases in volume briefly before dropping off. And then finally, the harp glissandos up the C major scale as a way of finishing the section on an uplifting note. Like in my previous analysis on Good Egg Galaxy, the harp here also uses a technique of glissando which uses both hands. Like I pointed out before, the pizzicato violins and the harp make up this neat pattern here. and the cello pizzicato provides the bass line. It should be noted that the violins and the second harp mirror each other note for note, so let's take a look at the violins first. A two-measure pattern that repeats once, simplistic yet pleasing to the ear as well. I love the fact that Kondo introduces us to this pattern before using a melody. Anyways, we switch back to the F major and harmonize in fourths the entire way through. Harp number 1 merely provides these single notes along with the chord progression. And as a last point in the violins, if you listen to both my version and the original, I intentionally left in mistakes to avoid sounding too mechanical. I imagine Kondo wanted the violins and the harp to be almost playful in a way. The cello pizzicato in many ways mirrors the first melody that we saw. Back in the intro. Again, it gives off a waltz feeling while still being in 4/4 time. Note the modest and methodical utilization of the bass here. Its only purpose is to fill in the gaps after the violin-harp combo ends. And then in section 1b, the first melody instrument is added, the flute. While the other instruments seem to stay the same, they in fact use a different chord progression. Instead of going up F to G and A, here it moves from the F to the A sharp, then back to the A, down to G, then up to A again, and you see it alternates between A and G, and then as a last tension note, it does this chord, which then resolves back to the loop. Let's take a look at the melody now. Notice the repetition of the two phrases. The first measure is repeated again one measure over, in a different key, and so is the second measure. Of course, there are small variations that prevent this melody from becoming monotonous. The use of different articulations in the flute, from staccato to legato, also make this melody stand out. This last note, the E, is known as the leading tone, which is the 7th note of the F major scale. The 7th note always seems to resolve neatly back to the 1 note, which is the F. Continuing on to section 1c, we see the complete reusage of this melody we just heard in the flute, this time in the clarinet. What Kondo is doing here is what I would say is a cheating way to compose, but effective nonetheless. Take an instrument playing a melody and replace it with another instrument, preferably one with a different tone. In my honest critique, I felt Kondo probably should have used a more contrasting instrument than the clarinet, but I could see his approach in unifying the song through these two similar instruments. Section 2 brings back the legato strings, who take over the melody from the clarinet. This time, however, the melody is different. But let's take a look at what the pizzicato violin and the harp are doing. Like before, the pizzicato violins and harp both double each other, while the first harp provides lower harmony. All of these actually play along with the cello pizzicato, which plays the same pattern as before. Now let's take a look at the chords. The chords move from the A sharp major, which is the 4th of F, and then an F in first inversion. Here we have a C in first inversion as well, and then back up to the F, which then repeats. Now here we move back up to the A sharp major instead of going down to the C in first inversion. And then at the end we move to this prominent C major chord. Now with the two harps and the cello all playing the same thing, it gives this really powerful statement in the music. As is common in many of Koji Kondo's melodies, he uses repetition in the string melody. I can't stress it enough that repetition is vitally important in composing melodies. A matching comparison to the first melody in the woodwinds is that the melody doesn't actually start until the first and beat. So first you hear these cello and violin and harp together, and then the melody. Also the quicker staccato section at the end here sort of mirrors what the clarinets and the flute are doing. During the second half of section 2, we see the tremolo strings enter, which give an almost ethereal quality. You would almost normally expect straight legato strings in this sort of register, but I like the use of tremolo strings here. A last note is that the flute doubles the violins at the end, as a way to add extra weight before the transition. So let's see it all together. We return to section 1, this time with the oboe leading as the melody, again with the same melody as before. Although there is a slight difference at the very end, where it doesn't end on the tense E note, but instead on the resolute home note of F. I think this was done to more successfully transition the listener to the section 3, which is unlike the other sections. The strings this time take on a new pattern, which kind of pulls off this F while still descending in the lower line. Both the violins and the violas double each other here, and using this sort of pattern is twofold. First, it keeps that F as the root note in the dominant key, and second, it allows for a lower descending chord progression. The cello is composed a bit simpler, again establishing the root note of F before surprisingly moving up to the F sharp. Considering that this is the tensest part of the song, it fits the music in this case. The oboe follows the chord progression, descending downward as well. And then we have our last instrument, the bass flute, which enters after the second iteration of this melody, and it plays the sweet melody. So let's play it all together. To conclude, we find ourselves back in section 1 again, with some slight variations. First, the tremolo strings return. The use of harmony, a sixth in this case, is absolutely fantastic, and the use of dynamics gives the impression of a wave permeating in the music. These harp glissandos also accent that wave illusion. Now let's play the song in full and return to the things we've discussed before. The bright timbre of the strings in the intro in section 1, how the simplistic nature of a few instruments can have on music, and how each melody instrument repeats the same melody as before. In section 2, the parallels in the string melody compared to the previous woodwind melodies. And finally in section 3, the downward progression in the strings, with the bass cello mostly staying on one note. The team at Nintendo struck gold again with the soundtrack to Super Mario Galaxy 2. I'm really glad that they stuck with the orchestral approach, especially given that the game is very similar to the first. I can tell that Kondo wanted to keep this song simple to really let the melody shine through. Starship Mario also takes on a similar style to other of Kondo's works in the past as well. Thank you for watching and listening. I made an analysis of Super Mario Galaxy 1's Good Egg Galaxy, so be sure to check that out before you depart. I thoroughly enjoy creating these videos, and I hope I can show you the tips and tricks the great composers of the past have put into their songs. I humbly thank you, and I wish you a fortunate day.